responsive teaching in 2023 and beyond. What is responsive teaching? Tom Sherrington describes responsive teaching as thinking on your feet, using evidence from real-time formative assessment, adjusting instructional inputs and practice activities. So, is responsive teaching the new AFL? I have here a historic AFL checklist. Is the learning objective clear and shared with children? Are children sure of the success criteria? Does the teacher use effective questioning? Do the children know what good learning looks like? Does the verbal feedback focus on the learning objective? Does the written feedback focus on the learning objective? Is there evidence that children act upon feedback to improve learning? Are pupils involved in self and peer assessment? Does the teacher periodically check the learning by some mechanism? Does the teacher adapt planning? And does the teacher reflect on how well the learning objective has been met? And I'll leave you and pause if necessary, have a think about, is that how we classify good lessons in our time now, or have things changed? Are there potential issues here? Learning objective and success criteria seem to get a little less focus than they once did. There was once a time when learning objectives, learning outcomes and success criteria were the big thing. The learning objective describes the skill I want you to learn. The learning outcome describes the standard you need to achieve, and the success criteria, well, these remind you how to reach the required standard. The secret of a good lesson was pedagogically sold as starting and displaying these, and the process of the lesson was visiting and revisiting them with particular focus at the end. If you had done what you had set out to do, the lesson was good or even outstanding if you managed to punctuate it with enough bells and whistles. I'm afraid this is not responsive teaching. John Hattie's research does attribute success criteria as having large impact on learning. But what he really means here is that if the students know what they are trying to achieve and what achievement looks like, they're more likely to take some ownership of it. There is little evidence to say that the impact of students copying or reading a set of learning objectives actually helps them learn. It could be argued that it is natural that a teacher who carefully considers a set of good learning objectives will likely plan a better lesson around them. It is my feeling that learning objectives have more impact on the quality of the lesson planned and less direct impact on the learning. Some students do like to know this, however. It gives them ownership, and some schools benefit from having a lesson structure and model that is consistent about the school. So I'm not anti-sharing learning objectives. There's strong evidence to suggest that there's more impact in students knowing what they are learning and why. The big picture. To give a historical backing to where we are heading in 2023, Madeline Hunter in 1982, that's 41 years ago, stressed the importance in teachers making constant checks for understanding. Although I'm sure that teachers have done this throughout history, this maybe marks a possible beginning to the journey. AFL, I believe, started its elevation to prominence in 1994. Many of the principles that underlie it were sound and sensible in terms of the intention they presented. Maybe with the exception of box ticking and filling in grids to level students to measure student progress, which could be compared with the national averages. I think everyone now agrees that anything that focuses time on something that doesn't help students learn should be treated with suspicion. In 1998, the famous work by Black and William, Inside the Black Box, looking at assessment again, worked on assessment, and it gave a lot of hope. It talked about formative assessment in a sensible way by looking at the impact of the feedback. 2005 to 2018 probably had some aspect of AFL as every focus in every lesson observation, every learning walk, and every school's improvement plan. This was the answer to raising standards. The intention was there, and it seemed to be sensible. And really, did it have an impact? Did we really see standards improve radically? Have they raised at all? I don't think we can answer this in a controlled scientific way, since there have been many social, political and pedagogical changes. No matter a different style of examination system now, which has different areas of focus. I can't help but feel, however, that the improved academic standards that many had hoped for have fallen short of the impact that they promised. Examinations grades can be argued to have marginally improved, but many say that the difficulty and the boundaries have just adjusted to show this. And why did all these strategies not have the impact that they promised to? Could it be the intent or the research behind the suggested methodologies? Were they flawed? I would argue not. Much of the AFL best practice has been observed to have its significant impact. It must therefore be the implementation. Maybe this is why responsive teaching is such a focus today. Maybe with the correct implementation, responsive teaching could have a big impact that maybe AFL, in the way it was implemented, fell so short. Looking at the list that I've put on the board, the checklist to try and create a perfect lesson, I think we can see that there are big issues there. What I think that worries me the most about the list is that it shows it's outdated, ineffective and not fit for purpose. It sells the idea of a good lesson as being a set of pedagogical hoops. And if a teacher plans a process-driven lesson and includes everything in the checklist, the lesson would be good or even outstanding. It is interesting that even the pedagogical hoops presented on this list omit what for me are 4 major signposts of a good lesson. What the teacher says, their oracy, what the teacher models, what the students do and say, and what the relationships are like. Planning or observing lessons in the past using the old AFL template would have had little concern with the impact of the learning weeks, months, and even years ahead. A process-driven lesson in 2023, where impact over time isn't the key consideration, surely will not deliver what it needs to. So this is why I've called this presentation Responsive Teaching in 2023 and beyond, because the word impact was not such a big deal 10 years ago as it is now. A lesson could pass as outstanding 10 years ago if the teacher pedagogically planned the correct series of hoops. Actions were the key and process central. Impact was a second thought. As long as the class could show enough green cards when the learning objectives were assessed at the end of the lesson must be good. Harry Fletcher Wood's book on responsive teaching discusses the flaws in how AFL was implemented and sets an evidence-based scene for responsive teaching and how it may be approached. I'd love our journey as we explore and develop responsive teaching to focus on the impact of our actions on learners rather than actions themselves. We will not be focusing on impact over a single lesson window, because we know, in truth, this may be temporary and is often meaningless. We will be looking at impact over time. A journey looking to develop responsive teaching will focus on routines and behaviours that are sustainable in every lesson, not just in observations. Behaviours that are highly skilled, maybe subtle, and usually subject specific. Teaching skills that are rooted in knowing students, knowing the subject, anticipating misconceptions, and knowing how best to address these issues. Responsive teaching in 2023 and beyond will look simple, but it will be highly skilled. I don't think the process-driven checklist that I shared earlier, that was maybe once fit for purpose, will pass the test anymore. I'd like to add that I see the phrase positive impact on learning as fairly synonymous with students having a deeper understanding of what they are learning. Neither impact or understanding is easy to measure. Assessing this and responding is the challenge of responsive teaching. Coming back to Tom Sheridan, who describes responsive teaching as thinking on your feet, using evidence from real-time formative assessment, adjusting instructional inputs and practice activities. A good analogy to a teacher skilled at responsive teaching seems to be like a skilled footballer who, on the whole, could probably perform breathtaking tricks, but for the most part prepares well and reliably and skillfully does their job doing simple things consistently, accurately, and effectively. So, is using mini whiteboards responsive teaching? No. Using mini whiteboards well, assessing what the class knows and understands, then responding to this in some way, yes, this is responsive teaching. And this is hard. We don't know what we will see, or maybe we anticipate what we may see. And maybe we will see lots of different things that will all need some form of different response. Maybe these responses need pre-planning, or maybe we need to think on our feet. Responsive teaching never promises to be easy. The challenge of responsive teaching is truly responding to what is shown. If the whiteboards show everyone is ready to move on, great. The whiteboards have been a useful task, but not responsive teaching. If 5 students have not got it, then these 5 students have their problems addressed, something different, then this is responsive. But how many students need to get it wrong to decide whether the whole class or just groups of students receive individual support? Responsive teaching certainly poses decisions that need to be made on the spot. There is the added complication of asking if the mini whiteboards expose conceptual understanding or some other kind of error. Can the teacher scanning the room differentiate between conceptual issues in understanding or just procedural errors? Does the teacher have the skill to then react? Teaching is complex. Responsive teaching is skillful and difficult. Mini whiteboards are a great tool that could give opportunity to responsively teach. I would challenge the person who uses mini whiteboards as a teaching tool to reflect on their own practice by trying to answer, how have they deepened student understanding? How has this deepened the teacher's knowledge of the student's position in their learning? How has it had an impact? So, is using exit tickets an example of responsive teaching? No. Using exit tickets is a lovely idea that could help you plan the next lesson. But unless you really use the exit ticket in your planning, it's just another piece of paper. Could collecting books be useful? Yes, as long as it instigates some form of action. Could looking carefully at the student's work during the lesson be responsive teaching also? Yes, of course, as long as action follows. Jo Morgan, a famous maths teacher, in a recent interview with Craig Barton, shared that she really liked exit tickets because they allowed her to plan her next lesson. She shared that because of this, she could never fully plan more than one lesson at a time and would need to make adaptations to what she may have expected to do in the next lesson. I'd argue that exit tickets as a tool for responsive teaching could perhaps offer a counterexample to Tom Sherrington's definition, who described responsive teaching as thinking on your feet. Maybe for less experienced teachers, exit tickets are a more accessible way to responsively teach. Exit tickets are certainly a non-negotiable practice promoted in lesson plans from a lot of student teachers. Collecting books, of course, could give a similar snapshot. For those not sure, diagnostic questions are a set of carefully chosen, usually multiple choice questions, where each incorrect answer shows a common misconception. Carefully chosen questions and possible responses inform the teacher of the next steps that need to be taken. Is diagnostic questioning responsive teaching? No. There is an interesting Craig Barton YouTube video clip explaining how diagnostic questioning can be used in responsive teaching. Planning the questions in itself is a science, and how the teacher responds to each specialist type of response is an art. For those I've spoken to who use diagnostic questions, perhaps as a hinge point question, they testify excellent outcomes. Some degree of sustained, dedicated departmental focus is needed if both the science and the art of diagnostic questioning is going to reap the rewards that it promises. Diagnostic questioning seems to integrate well with technology, clickers perhaps being the most familiar form. I predict that diagnostic questioning will in many ways be in the assessment that paves the way to responsive teaching in the future. Maybe something we should all be considering. Hinge point questions can be a type of diagnostic questioning. Sometimes they're mini whiteboard exercises. These are often put mid-lesson. Sometimes the I do, we do, you do sequence has the we do part as a hinge point question. Are these responsive teaching? No. The teacher looking at the students responsively and then doing something, maybe lots of different things. This is responsive teaching. So what other opportunities can we make for responsive teaching? Assessment. Professor Rob Coe emphasises should tell you what your pupils know, understand and can do. It has to support teaching and learning. Any assessment is an opportunity for responsive teaching. In fact, any assessment that is not taken as an opportunity for responsive teaching is an opportunity lost, and an opportunity wasted, and arguably an assessment with the wrong motivations. We assess to identify the next stages in student learning, and the assessment should be skillfully tailored for this purpose. And that is it. We don't plan assessments for the main purpose of reporting, quality assurance, appraisal, or for seeking to demonstrate progress, although these things should all be possible if our assessments are robust. We plan assessment to help us plan the next steps in our teaching and to give us opportunity for students to show us what they can do and what they understand. I think the mathematician in me, and maybe the historical way I've always gathered information that involves me putting mark after mark in my planner. I like the honesty and the non-subjectivity in the set of numerical marks. I like averaging them out and looking for trends over time. I like the way I can use them along with past data to predict how my class are going to do and how they are likely to do over time. I like to compare their progress, maybe with other classes, and speculate whether they will meet their target grades. It's a lovely way to follow a student's progress and celebrate their and my own successes. And many like-minded teachers who have been around for a while with this game that we play over and over again. And yes, there are interesting and useful things that can come from it. This is not responsive teaching, however, and much of what I like doing with data has no impact on the students. It won't help my class learn. In 2023, I need to change what I do. I need to change the way I think and stop doing what I like doing and am comfortable with if I'm going to make the best use of my valuable teacher time and have more impact on the students I teach. If I know my students well enough, and if my ongoing assessments have been as good as they should be, my classroom will already be data rich. There are qualitative indications all around me about who can do what, and who understands what, and to what degree. A skillful teacher will have mechanisms planned throughout each lesson, mechanisms that can become almost second nature to gather this information. Responsive teaching asks us to trust this information more and more and become increasingly skilled in using it meaningfully and in real time. It is worth me noting, however, that responsive teaching does not say that departments don't need their own mechanisms to consistently gather useful data. Responsive teaching does, however, require a shift in focus on how we think about this data, in particular what our primary focus is and what we do with it. Grades and marks mean very little when it comes to responsive teaching. It's all about, on an individual level, what can they do and what do they understand? Sometimes a written test showing lack of understanding may have the impact on students, departmental leaders, pastoral leaders, and maybe parents that sparks some form of bigger trigger of focus or concern. Some may argue that for the student who doesn't understand very much and for the student who cannot do very much, the experience of doing a formal assessment and the feelings of inadequacy or failure that they may experience from doing it, if the teacher already knows, they will be able to do very little. In the spirit of responsive teaching, where an assessment is only worthwhile if it can have an impact, this test is not right for this student at this time. So what other opportunities can we make for responsive teaching? Good questioning and reacting, looking at student work and reacting, listening to conversations between students and maybe reacting, and having conversations with students. Talking to students about their learning. A highly skilled teacher who I worked with, who had an impeccably good record of good outcomes, used to have a really effective practice of responsive teaching that he used time and time again and to great effect. After a period of what I always observed to be excellent teaching and instruction, he would direct the class to complete an exercise where they would mark their own work, and he would collect this. The class would help each other, but he would sit at the front, calling them up individually. He would discuss their work individually, take an interest in what they were doing, and give them individual verbal feedback, praise, and find areas and misconceptions bespoke to each student. He would move through the class list in a systematic order, so no student was ever missed. Obviously, if a student needed help or lots of students needed something, the order would change. But it worked, and it did have an impact. It was a simple routine, and it was effective. I can't think of much of a better example of responsive teaching if the class could be trained to work in this way. I think a consequence of responsive teaching means we have to respond individually to students, or maybe with small groups of students, developing a culture where 100% attention does not need to be given to the whole class at all times. It's essential to be responsive if it's going to be truly effective. Relationships will need to be excellent, and the very process of individually responding to students' needs will only make relationships better and better. The teacher standards have been around now for a while. In many ways, standard 4, 5 and 6 create quite a groundwork for responsive teaching. It has often been my feeling that these 3 would make a nice starting sequence to the whole list of standards, and in many ways they form a cycle from which the other teaching standards can feed into and from where progress can be seen. Behaviour, progress, subject knowledge and aspirations all follow into these 3 and feed from these 3. I think that when we talk about responsive teaching as a personal point for teacher development, the teacher has to already have real strengths in instruction, modelling and subject knowledge. Student teachers, for example, on day 1 of teaching need to be told, teach this and do it this way. Maybe this evolves into following a scheme of work before long, and maybe a pattern is built up early that is somewhat unresponsive. Responsive teaching is highly skilled, the aspiration of every teacher and what every student deserves. If the teacher's explanation of the topic is insufficient enough for a large proportion of the class who have the prerequisite potential to understand but don't, then the responsive teaching is neither the problem or the solution. If teacher explanation and modelling is poor, it stands to reason our assessment of the class, although it may be thorough, will show that there has not been an impact on learning and understanding. And the issue is that time is wasted, and whatever was taught needs to be explained and modelled for the whole class again. If, however, in the class of 30, the teaching has been sufficient enough for, say, 25 students to proceed to a point where they can move to application, responsive teaching, after some form of assessment, can take place to address the issues in the other 5 students. This is perfect. Graham Nuttall observed that no matter how well you describe something, how well you illustrate and explain it, students invent some new way to misunderstand what you have said. And this is the point when responsive teaching comes in, after you have described, modelled and explained it well. A PowerPoint or resource is not a lesson plan. I lifted this slide directly from the CPD I did last year on teaching and learning, on lesson planning versus lesson preparation. A lesson plan is not a PowerPoint. It's much more about what you say, what you model, and how you plan your interaction. PowerPoints can be used well, but they can, if used badly, detract a class's attention from what the teacher is saying, especially if the teacher is reading from the PowerPoint in real time. PowerPoints with solutions on that is simply flicked through can also deprive students from seeing how a solution or modelled answer can be constructed by their teacher. Can PowerPoints help structure in the planning of a lesson? Yes. Can PowerPoints help structure assessment? Yes, they can. Can PowerPoints be used to find opportunity for responsive teaching? Yes. Can responsive teaching be facilitated on a PowerPoint? I'd argue no. Can they be followed rigidly? No. This is teaching in spite of the students. What if PowerPoints are used to plan your sequence of lessons? This can and will be a real barrier for responsive teaching. PowerPoints intended to be used, lesson 1, 2, 3, etc., are a recipe for disaster if not adapted between lessons. They can make a good framework, however, and then be adapted to make them even better and even more fit for purpose to have an impact. What about textbooks? A planned programme of work that moves Lesson 1, Exercise 3A, Lesson 2, 3B, Lesson 3, Exercise 3C is a recipe for disaster in terms of responsive teaching, unless there's room for adaptation when it is needed. If the main teacher starting point for the majority of lessons is opening a textbook and starting at question 1, then there are, in my opinion, going to be some real barriers for the teacher to actively embrace responsive teaching. To say a few words in support of a curriculum that is resourced by textbooks, if you know the content well and have planned thoroughly and can move students through the exercise in a way that meets their needs, then this can be wonderful responsive teaching. What about curriculum planning? Well, it goes without saying that all lessons should be a reflection of the curriculum planning, and departmental and shared curriculum planning should be the source from which lessons are delivered. Very advanced curriculum planning may have guidance describing what responsive teaching may look like. There must be flexibility, however, to allow the teacher to respond. I'd suggest that if curriculum planning is going to move in the direction of developing responsive teaching, misconceptions, hinge point questions, and maybe diagnostic questioning resources may be things to consider. Are pre-assessments needed for responsive teaching? The most important factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Find out what it is that you already know and teach it accordingly. A quote from Ausable. Another one from Graham Nuttall. We find out that a substantial amount of what teachers teach or attempt to teach is already known by a significant number of kids in the class. I do not particularly like blanket rules, such as every topic needs a pre-test or every lesson needs to start with retrieval. Not unless some of the motivation behind that is school policy and consistency. The idea that planning of a new lesson needs to be on a foundation that the teacher can be confident is secure seems sensible. The teacher has, in some way, to plan to make sure that this is assessed. Some retrieval questions, some questioning, an informal test, or some kind of thinking task, I think are all good ideas. Pre-tests followed by a post-test has, however, historically been used as a mechanism for teachers to try and evidence that their classes are making progress. And this is the reason that has been chosen for the teacher to set a pre-test. Obviously, a hard pre-test that no one can do and a post-test that is very achievable and gives good scores evidences wonderful progress. But what a sad and pointless way to dedicate the finite resource we have of teacher and student time. Hoops like these are not the direction of travel for responsive teaching, and every effort needs to be made to avoid them. This is a beautiful paragraph I found in a book, and it's one that really resonates well with me, one which is really challenging. One which I think helps us evaluate our lessons in a much more responsive way. An effective education system is one that focuses on teaching approaches that maximise subsequent progression rather than pursuit of short-term superficial success. There's another quote by Daisy Christodoulou: review every lesson plan in terms of what the student is thinking about. And I did this for quite a few weeks, looking at students, and sometimes my best students in the class, I couldn't tell if they were actually thinking about what they were doing or going through a process. I think it's really challenging when we use that idea of what are students thinking about and evaluate our lesson based on that, because the more they think, the better they understand, the better they'll be. How much of our lessons are actually process driven? It's a really challenging idea, but one that I would highly advocate, and I think it's very much in line with the principles that responsive teaching is trying to develop. So why don't we reflect more on what students are thinking about and what students understand? This certainly wasn't a huge feature in the old AFL ideas. The truth is that it's hard to look at a student who is on task and really know what they're thinking about. Sometimes for students who lack resilience and concentration, it's a bit disheartening to really consider how much time they are focused on the desired objectives during the lesson. We feel it's far better for their well-being, and sometimes our own, if we set lower order tasks that will likely produce more success. Following a simple process or recalling some basic facts. We may feel that this approach will have a better impact on the class's behaviour as a whole. Maybe it will raise self-esteem and they'll feel that they've come away being able to do something. I think we often see this with retrieval starters, where the main aim may be getting students in the room and in the room quietly. I make no judgment of this and cannot criticise anyone who uses this mechanism to get a class starting smoothly. I've done it myself, and I've advised others to do so at the beginning of a lesson, especially if it's in some way disordered. I spoke to a colleague recently who's an excellent teacher and gets good results. He shared that he is adamantly opposed to starting off a lesson with something routine that the class will automatically be able to do. The argument he had was that if he wants the culture of the lesson to be students thinking, being engaged, and having challenge, then something contrary to this will immediately set a tone away from what is expected. I'm not saying one thing is right and the other wrong. Maybe if just a basic, simple retrieval is the current practice, and in itself an opportunity for responsive teaching of recalled practice, an element of application and challenge could align to it to allow the teacher to assess thinking. Responsive teaching focuses on understanding. It is well documented that students who learn content and processes without understanding will likely forget the content and the process. Students who understand will likely remember processes, and we, to again quote Mark McCourt, will be able to see progression rather than pursuit of short-term superficial success. The old AFL cycle could make a lesson look good if the objectives were process-driven and at the end of the lesson saw these objectives were met. If we want impact, we want understanding. If we want understanding, we need to plan our lessons to contain more challenge. The problem remains as to how a culture can be formed where students persevering through problems and have to think deeply can remain on task and behave in the way they need to. And there are certainly no easy solutions to this. I would suggest that cultures for doing this type of learning may take many years to establish. Perhaps teaching this way will always be harder. Primary schools are, however, investing more and more in thinking activities, and it would be wrong to assume that a new Year 7 class is incapable of being set this expectation from day one in secondary school. Although there is a balance in setting something students will be unable to engage with, and therefore move off task with, there is also an argument in saying that a list of easy routine questions may set a tone for which students may choose not to behave well with. I don't think the journey towards improving our skills in responsive teaching can be separated from the journey to directly impact student thinking and the way they think. It's not my position to criticise anyone for giving up their lunch times or anyone going the extra mile for students. Teachers, by their very nature, give over and above to try and support students and make an impact. I myself spend lunch times trying to help students, and I do this by choice, and this is fine. I can't help but feel the spirit of responsive teaching is embedded in quality first teaching. We can never let ourselves go down the route where a large number of the misconceptions we identify become problems for lunchtime. It's not fair on either the teacher or the student. There seems something very wrong to me for a teacher due to lack of planning time or exhaustion because of lunchtime or holiday intervention sessions, then not being able to plan top quality lessons for the classroom. In an ideal world, lesson time and reasonable homework windows should be enough time for the majority of students, perhaps with TA support, to develop the understanding they need to be successful. Sadly, we do not live in an ideal world, and there will always be exceptions. I don't think we should set our plan for responsive teaching, however, to include lunch times, holiday clubs, after school clubs. I think these should be the exceptions and done by choice. So how can I become better at responsive teaching? Well, Harry Fletcher Wood says there are no responsive teaching techniques. I think I've mentioned a lot of useful ideas already, such as using mini whiteboards, exit tickets, diagnostic questioning, clickers. I've seen all these done to great effect, and I'm in awe of some of the practitioners who use them. Responsive teaching is about simple ideas done well. Looking at work in the classroom, looking at it carefully and responding. By this I mean monitor the room as students work, spot misconceptions and correct them. Skillful teachers in an environment conducive to learning can move about a room and they can correct issues on the spot. Sometimes moving through the classroom with a red pen can have a huge impact. Look at work outside the classroom carefully and respond. By this, I'm not saying that every bit of work needs teacher marking. We simply are not in a world where this is possible, although notably in primary schools this is often the practice. I do think in September, when you have new classes, responsive teaching in this way has a huge impact in setting the climate and the environment for learning and getting to know the students. As the year progresses, a teacher needs to organise routine where this works. In part of the research I talked about earlier, in the black box, focus was on making this marking meaningful and have impact. Marking and producing feedback is always a balance of time and impact. And I don't think any teacher can honestly say they have cracked this one and also maintained a healthy work-life balance. I think looking at a class, however, and asking the question, is what I'm doing or what I have done really having an impact? Can I adapt what I do to have more impact? I think for less organised teachers, developing a routine in looking at student work on cycle is essential. Getting to know students and listening to them carefully and responding. I don't think anyone, including Hattie and his effect sizes, can argue the impact of student-teacher relationships is crucial. Talking to students, taking an interest in their learning, trying to establish what their barriers and misconceptions are and helping them directly. This is responsive teaching at its very core. I would argue that when a teacher does not know their class, their capacity to be responsive is massively reduced, since they don't know where to look first to be responsive. Although being responsive by its very nature must mean for us we need to adapt and think on our feet, and could face the unexpected. To have the biggest impact, we must know who may have the likely misconceptions and what these misconceptions are. Obviously, in a class of 30, responding to 30 different issues individually will never be possible. If the culture of students responding to each other can be developed, responsive teaching can take on a whole new level. Look to focus on our understanding rather than process. Every action the teacher makes in the learning window is an opportunity to in some way have an impact. If there is a way to differentiate between spending time on conceptual misconceptions and time correcting procedural errors, the former will certainly have more impact. Responding to tasks that expose understanding is an essential part of responsive teaching. And try something new, because improving on any skill needs an active decision to do something differently. If you want to develop skills in responsive teaching, you cannot just look for reassurance that what you do is already perfect. You must be prepared to do something different. On questioning. Effective questioning is a skill that can be learned. All teachers intuitively question pupils for a variety of reasons, but do it well. Requires planning and an understanding of how to engage and push pupils' thinking. I quoted there from the TLSS Pedagogy and Practice materials. Research shows that all teachers use more closed questions than open questions. However, more effective teachers use a greater number of open questions than less effective teachers. And again, that's quoted from the TLSS Pedagogy and Practice materials. Questioning in the context of responsive teaching needs to ask the question, what do they need to evidence for me to know that they have understood? My questions need to elicit what I need from them. The research shows in secondary classrooms 70 to 80% of questions require a simple factual response, and 20 to 30% of questions lead pupils to explain, clarify, expand, generalize, infer. Now, one may say that maybe there are barriers on behaviour, but it also shows that in Key Stage 5, it gets worse. Less and less questions ask students to think on a higher level. If we're to effectively assess and teach for understanding, we need to ask questions that are appropriate to this. Bloom's taxonomy was historically used to develop and support this. I think the principle of Bloom's are very valid as to a way to develop our questioning. Why, prove, show, explain, apply, critique are certainly more exploratory question openers than what, or questions that essentially ask, can you recall something? So, are simple ideas good enough when it comes to responsive teaching? Can simple things done well have a real impact? In a word, yes, responsive teaching is all about doing simple and effective things and doing them well. There are no hoops or things to evidence in lessons. The real question is about impact. Is what I am doing having an impact on all students? To quote from Ofsted as well, which I know is a motivation for many of us teachers to try and do particular things. Teachers present subject matter clearly, promoting appropriate discussion about the subject matter they're teaching. They check learners' understanding systematically, identify misconceptions accurately, and provide clear, direct feedback. In doing so, they respond and adapt their teaching as necessary, without unnecessary, elaborate, or differentiated approaches. The Ofsted framework supports everything that I've been saying about what responsive teaching is. Teachers and learners use assessment well, for example, to help learners embed and use knowledge fluently, or check understanding and inform teaching. So, to bring a close to my presentation, responsive teaching in 2023 and beyond, if it's going to be worthwhile, is going to be evaluated by doing simple things well and motivated by impact on students. It's not going to be about procedure. Thank you for listening. I very much appreciate any feedback, and my details are on this slide. Thank you again.